Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for staying. I'm hoping that you're hoping that they've saved the best for last. All right. This is the badge for an OpenSSF scorecard, and you get a green one if it's more than 8. And the whole purpose of this talk is, I think this is a way of showing people that you care about security. If they come to your repo and they see a badge like this, and especially if it's a nice green one because you've got a score over 8, then you've clearly done some stuff that shows that you care about security. And the rest of this talk is going to be about what's involved in doing that stuff and how much effort is actually taken to do that. This is a page that we have on our .github profile where we can show all of our kind of key repos and the associated scorecard badges that go with them. So we've got the badge in the repo itself and this kind of summary page. And when I snapshotted it yesterday, they were all green, which is nice. When I'd snapshotted it a few days ago beforehand, we had one which was a sort of murky green because it was below an 8. So hi, I'm Chris Swan. You can find my socials and stuff at chris.swans.net. I'm an engineer at a startup called @Sign. We're building a next-generation networking platform which is based upon personal data stores and also implements end-to-end encryption between people using the apps based on it and the various people, devices, and entities that they might be communicating with. All of that stuff is stuff that gives people kind of heebie-jeebies about security. Because if we're not implementing what we do in a secure way, then things like end-to-end encryption are all for naught. And so very frequently we get asked, how do we know that what you're doing is secure? And that is why we put security scorecards on all of our repos, because we can point at those scorecards and say, look at the scorecard. And then look behind the scorecard at what that's telling you. And my colleagues in sales and biz dev have so far said that this actually works. When we tell people to look at the scorecard, they go, oh, wow, actually, you do care about security. We're quite happy about that. We started doing this because of Google's efforts in this area. We're a big user of Dart and Flutter. A little while back, Google started putting scorecards onto the Dart and Flutter repos. They blogged about it. We read the blog and thought, yeah, this seems like a fine idea. And then we got stuck in ourselves. I think another little fringe benefit as well is if I think about how much it would have cost Google to have done that for big projects like Dart and Flutter, then that's probably millions of dollars. And I've got a colleague who worked at Google, and he's kind of, yeah, probably. When we did this, at least first time around, I reckon it clocked us up about $10,000 of engineer time. So orders of magnitude less. And I think when our customers look at those scorecards and think about how that relates to their build versus buy decision, they're making that similar kind of balance. And I think it's just a lot less costly to get things done in a startup. All right, so this is what I'm going to talk about. Who are the OpenSSF, if you don't know that already, and what is a scorecard? I'm going to suggest that if you're doing this yourself, start with a different OpenSSF project that's called All-Star, because that'll help you put down the foundations. I'm going to cover what's involved in doing your first repo, and then taking what you've learned from that process and scaling it across multiple repos. And then there's a kind of Pareto effect comes into this. So I think it takes about 20% of the effort to get 80% of the score. And then after you've done that, it takes about 80% more effort to get the remaining 20% of the score. And then last of all, I'm going to talk about the toil of it all. Doing this does create toil, and it does make you want to do more engineering to then reduce that toil. As I was doing the application for this talk. There were two aspects I was asked to cover. One was sustainability, and the other was diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'll talk about sustainability first. And I'm going to kind of make this somewhat glib statement. Visibly well-maintained software is more sustainable software. And I think that is actually true because it requires less time and resources to keep up to date and adapt to the changing world around us. So software ages like milk rather than like wine. If you leave it alone, it bit rots and it gets bad. If you do the things that you have to do to get a decent score on a scorecard, you will not be allowing that to happen. So who are OpenSSF and what is a scorecard? So the OpenSSF is the Open Source Security Foundation. They are part of the Foundation Industrial Complex within the Linux Foundation. And so if you're already a Linux Foundation member for other reasons, that would mean that getting involved in OpenSSF from a formal basis will cost you less in dues because you're just kind of adding to your existing subscriptions, essentially. OpenSSF are doing a ton of really valuable work around encouraging people to build more secure software. If you look at the organizations involved, you will see Google in particular featuring very prominently. And so, yeah, they've been visibly adopting a lot of OpenSSF stuff and contributing to a lot of OpenSSF stuff. More recently, Arun Gupta, who's been a figurehead in open source for a little while, landed at Intel, and he's now taken a role as sort of the chair of the OpenSSF. And I'm seeing a lot of activity at Intel, getting Intel repos, wearing scorecard badges and that sort of thing. So it seems to be one of these things that's propagating across the industry. The scorecard itself is a set of measures to determine whether you're doing things in a secure way, and it looks at multiple different areas. So do you have known vulnerabilities in your code? So we were just talking about SBOMs and CVEs and all that sort of stuff, and it's generally a bad idea to have known vulnerabilities. So if you've got known vulnerabilities, you should be getting rid of those. Are you maintaining the code and the repo around the code? So, you know, is it live? Are you checking how contributions are being done? Is there branch protection there? Testing, also a good idea. So, you know, is stuff actually being tested before it's being merged? Do you have evidence of that in the form of continuous integration pipelines, et cetera, and coverage for unit tests, functional tests, and any other testing strategies that you might be using? Dependencies. That was being covered in the panel as well. So is there a mechanism for establishing the risk of your upstream dependencies? And from that, are you able to make judgments about the security overall of the software that's being produced? And then another big area of OpenSSF activity is around the software supply chain and how that can be subverted. So another aspect of the scorecard is build risk assessment. So, you know, do you have a build system that is robust, understood, and that can adapt to anything that you then learn that might need to be reacted to? So these are put together as being a set of holistic security practices. Those are turned into tests that can be run against a repo, and you can then put a GitHub action into that repo, which will run the tests, generate the scorecard, and you get the badge. But I suggest that you don't actually jump straight into doing that. There's another OpenSSF package called All-Star, This is actually a GitHub application, and it's something that can be deployed on a GitHub organization basis. It comes with some fairly sensible defaults, and this is basically the tell me when I'm being negligent app. So when you're being negligent, Allstar will bother you with issues. And so an example would be binaries in repos. The default setup for Allstar is it doesn't like to see binaries in repos. And so when it finds binaries in your repos, it'll raise an issue. So if you install Allstar and you've got binaries in your repos, you'll suddenly have a whole bunch of issues to deal with, and you'll kind of go around whack-a-moling them and expunging all of this stuff. And then a few months later, one of your colleagues will do a demo at CES and come back and put all of the code into a repo, and there'll be a little binary in there, and the issue will get reopened. And at that point, much gnashing of teeth will happen, but it'll get fixed. But this provides a really strong foundation for a lot of the work that follows with the scorecards. Talking to one of the chaps at a big company that's doing scorecards at the moment, they said they didn't start with Allstar, and it's a decision he's now regretting. So it does seem to be a sort of sensible foundation. When you put Allstar in place, you will find that to appease it, you need to have a whole bunch of config for the repos, but also a whole bunch of files in place, so things like security.md. And I've found that these are the two tools I pick up to sort all of this out. So Terraform can help you with the config. I was bending ears at GitHub as recently as yesterday evening to say, wouldn't it be nice if we could just have an adult mode on GitHub organizations that got us away from all of the unsafe defaults and into the config that makes sense for this stuff? But for now, that does not exist. Apparently there's stuff in the works, but all of the attention's on Copilot. So for now, you need to use something like Terraform to get all of the config groomed and in shape. And then Terraform isn't my preferred weapon for putting the files in place. So I use a thing called git-xargs, which is a really nice tool for kind of blasting repo after repo after repo, so a whole list of repos put the same change into all of these repos. So if you want to put something like security.md into 30 repos, git-xargs has your back on that. So doing your first repository. You put the GitHub action in, it runs on the next PR that you merge, and you end up with hundreds of issues in the security tab on GitHub. And initially, this is a bit kind of, ugh, that's a long list of things. And it's not as bad as it initially looks, because a lot of these things can be dealt with as classes rather than instances. So you can solve dozens of these at a time by going after the root cause rather than having to pick them off individually. Also, help is at hand. So the security report that will be generated by the workflow will point you in the direction of the tools that will help remediate this stuff. So especially for things like dependency pinning, the Step Security Apply Best Practices tool will take all of your actions workflows and pin all of their dependencies to shards. Just do all of that stuff for you. And if you look at that 128 closed issues on my first repo, about 123 of them were these. And so they were pretty rapidly taken care of by that. But it's not just GitHub Actions that you have to worry about. You've got dependency pinning hell to deal with your choice of package manager. Some are nicer than others. There is also, once you get into this stuff, a realization of there's probably things you're doing in GitHub Actions that are bringing in dependencies at build time that none of this stuff is touching. So there's a little bit of a Jedi mind trick going on here, and there's not as much help as you might need in order to keep that stuff maintained if you really do kind of go down that hole. So scaling this stuff across multiple repositories, and you've done your first one, it had 128 issues, you've knocked them all down, now what? Well, you've probably got dozens more repos to go. But actually, it gets kind of easier because the patterns can be repeated, and it's a rinse and repeat with the same tools as before for All-Star. So Terraform to take care of all the config, branch protection, and then Git xargs to get all of the boilerplate in place so that the files are all there when they should be. And a bunch more of this. So you can automate the step security bits, and you can even, if you want, wrap that up into scripts that are going to kind of Git xargs all of the dependency pinning and that sort of thing. The other thing that's happening here, as well as dependency pinning, is token restrictions. And so it's looking for sensible token restrictions so that the GitHub Actions token can't kind of run amok on your repos, which is the default. So just making sure that you've got that locked down to read only as a sort of top level. And then if you really do need to write, and sometimes you really do need to write, then you're only setting that write permission exactly where it's needed. So thus far, we'll get you to 80% of the score with about 20% of the effort. And there will be a residue, and it'll look something like this. Like, do you have static analysis? Do you have fuzzing? Do you have CII best practices? CII is a sort of older name for OpenSSF. So now rechristened OpenSSF best practices. Some of these things can be quite tricky, depending upon your choice of languages and frameworks. So if you're in a very traditional environment of C or C++ or Java, then you have ample choices of static analysis and dynamic analysis tools. If you're using funky new stuff, like we do with Dart, then there's nothing. And so some of it is built into the language. And so actually, Dart's got a static analyzer built into it, but not one that's recognized by the scorecard, so you can't actually knock that pin down. Whereas Dart does not have a fuzzer. And you can go and talk to the people that make fuzzers, and they're like, oh yeah, Dart Flutter on our to-do list. Might get around to it next year or 3. And so a lot of this stuff's driven by the popularity of languages and how much revenue there might be associated with security tools for them. CII best practices is where it gets really gnarly. So this kind of pings you off to filling in a questionnaire. And the questionnaire, as far as I can tell, is essentially a subset of the NIST cybersecurity framework of, have you done all of these things that we know are good things to do to make you secure? And so there are literally hundreds of questions, especially if you're trying to go for the gold badge. And a lot of them are asking you to do things that are probably a bit awkward. So the questionnaire is long and detailed. I've just taken a screenshot here of new functionality testing. And there's musts in here, there's suggested in here. And so you can kind of squeak by with some of this stuff not being completely pucker. But if you want to get the top line score, then you're going to have to do an awful lot more work. And so this is where kind of getting that last 20% of the score is starting to take 80% of the effort because it's kind of a law of diminishing returns. This is why you do not see scorecard badges with scores in the 9s, and I've never seen a 10, because it is an awful lot of work. And some sections might be hard to accomplish. So if, for example, you're using a language that doesn't have dynamic analysis tools, you can't really fill out the section on dynamic analysis saying, yeah, because that would be a massive pack of lies. So it brings me on to the toil of it all. And I would say, especially with the dependency pinning, make friends with the new boss, Dependabot. They're going to be having you do a lot of work. So this is a little snapshot from a docs repo, no actual code to maintain, over the course of less than 2 weeks. And you can see PR. So all of this is taking, even if it's just minutes, it's effort in order to press the button, review, merge. And it's especially problematic if you've got long test cycles and these things are queuing up. This is from a code repo over a similar period of time. I'm not expecting people to read off the individual lines of that. I was just putting it there as a comparison of, there was probably half a dozen on the last slide, and there's a lot more here, because once you put actual code into play, then of course Dependabot's got a lot more work to do for you. Or you've got a lot more work to do for it, as you get up every morning to dozens of PRs. Things like Docker files need roll-ups. This I can blame on Dependabot not supporting wildcards in directories. And so if you've got Docker files in different places in your repo, you'll get a different PR for every one of them. Nice. And so in this particular repo, we have Docker files in 4 different places, which means we get 4 different PRs every time that something changes. So you can deal with that with a roll-up, and you just need a little script and kind of tell it to merge all of the branches together, and then that turns that into one PR, which can then run through your CI and be merged. Scorecard's own dependencies, like CodeQL, change with annoying regularity. So just implementing this thing itself is adding, again, more toil. And so this is begging for more automation or for sort of greater high-level functionality in GitHub itself. Base dependencies can be amplified. So the Dart official Docker image is based upon the Debian official Docker image. So every time Debian gets an update, you get Dependabot PRs for all of the things that are using Debian. But it also then ripples through to Dart, so you get a whole bunch of PRs for that as well. So that's another reason why you'd be wanting to do roll-ups. So we're near the end. Quick review of what I've been talking about. To the topic of the talk, an OpenSSF scorecard can show that you care about security, and the badge in the repo is a visible marker of that care. And if it's green, then hopefully that's showing people that you've done some work as part of that. So if you've got a badge with a score of like 3 or something, you might not actually want to have that on your repo because it shows that you don't care about security. All-Star provides a really good starting point, and so I'd recommend installing that app before getting serious with scorecards themselves. Pick a first repo to get the hang of it. You maybe want a repo that's sort of medium complexity relative to your other ones, so that it's juicy enough that you experience all of the issues you're likely to come across later, but maybe not such an onerous one that it's like a massive chore to just slog through that very first repo. Once you've got through that first repo, you can then automate the same processes across the rest of the organization. I think it takes about 20% of the effort to get 80% of the score, and 80% of the score is 8. And 8 gets you a green badge. So 20% of the effort kind of just about gets you over the line. But scorecards, once you've got there, do create ongoing toil, and that needs a little bit more engineering work to be minimized. I like to have a call to action when I do a talk. And so the call to action here is you don't even need to install the GitHub action. You can run the command line version of Scorecard against any repo open source or private or whatever, you can keep what it tells you completely to yourself, especially if you don't like it. But this is a way of just getting a feeling of what the scores are going to look like and how much work might be involved in dealing with that repo. So give it a shot. You might already be really good and just have to do a little bit more work, or it might be a horror story and you run away. Some resources. These slides are already uploaded to Shed, so you can download the slides and then follow the links. So I wrote a couple of blog posts about this. One, which is kind of the blog post accompaniment of the talk, and the other, which is about the code for the rollups. We have a repo called @GitHub, or a section of our .github repo, where we talk about how we use GitHub @sign. So scorecards are part of that, but we also talk about some of the other tooling and methodologies that we've adopted in order to make it kind of part of our day-to-day practices. The panel was talking about culture, and my preferred definition of culture is the way we do things around here. And we wrote down the way we do things around here so that other people joining us as interns and stuff could actually see. Varun Sharma, who's the co-founder of Step Security, he did a talk about scorecards at QCon last year, and he set up a demo org, and it's got some Terraform templates in there, and so go and steal from that as well. So I started with sustainability. I'm going to close with diversity, equity, and inclusion. One of the things that comes out of doing this is having your repo comply with community guidelines. I don't know if any of you have seen this little check that's in the Insights tab on GitHub, but it'll tell you whether you're complying with what they consider to be community guidelines, which is things like having a code of conduct. All-Star and scorecards will make you do these things. And so it's part of the OpenSSF best practices and part of implementing scorecards. And so there is actually a connection between doing this and supporting diversity, equity, inclusion. And so I think that's a good kind of fringe benefit of making all of your repos secure. So thank you for your time, particularly as we're closing out the day. And go and enjoy your beverages now. Thank you.